Now that sounds like a somewhat of a boastful thing. It almost sounds too grandiose, doesn't it? But think about it. God has already used the actions of children to change his world. I've mentioned several already because children carry the flame of the future in their hearts and in their minds. I want to tell you one quick story, and we'll do this dedication. I flew in last night. Cindy and I were in Alabama over the weekend. And we flew back last night from Huntsville, Alabama. And I was asked to go back to Huntsville to conduct a funeral yesterday. And the funeral was for a dear friend of ours. His name was Jim Atherton. And Jim was a NASA scientist. He was one of those people that we talk about, you know, when we say, well, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand this. I used to say to Jim, even a rocket scientist should be able to understand this. But Jim was one of those men. He moved to Huntsville to work for NASA. And he told me one time, he said, I moved to Huntsville to change the world. And he was a part of the Apollo program. He helped launch these rockets that went to the moon, launched into outer space. A brilliant man. However, Jim, as a member of that church, after we had been there for a year or so, he came to me and Cindy, and he said, our church needs to do something, and I want to help you do it. He said, there's a little girl that grew up in our church. Her name is Susan Tidwell. And now she's an adult, and you've never met her, but you know her family because they're in our church. And Susan Tidwell was a missionary nurse in Mali, West Africa. And he said, as far as I know, no one from our church has ever been to see Susan. We've never really blessed her ministry. And he said, we need to go see Susan. And he asked Cindy, would you help me do it? Now, later, I would have a chance to talk with Susan. And here's what Susan told me. She said, I was a little girl growing up in First Baptist Huntsville, and I was in the GAs. And she said, and one day my teacher in the GAs said, our class is going to make a presentation to the ACT teens, and I want you to do it, and it's on West Africa. And Susan Tidwell said, I was a little girl, and I studied, and I made a presentation to the ACT teens, which were the older girls. And she said, as a little girl, while I was studying, God put it in my heart and in my mind, I'm calling you to go serve in Africa. Well, unbeknownst to Jim Atherton, when he was having a conversation with Cindy, he didn't know that when Cindy was a 9-year-old girl in GAs in her church, she felt that similar call to go to Africa and somehow serve the people, and had not yet been able to live that out. And so Cindy came to me and said, you know what? Our kids are old enough. I think I want to go. We've never met Susan, but we want to go help her. And Jim said, well, I want to help make it happen. He said, I've never done anything like this before. I'm a rocket scientist, not a missionary. And so Jim Atherton and Cindy led that very first team, and they went to Mali, West Africa. When they got home, the first night, Cindy and I went to dinner. And she had never been to Africa, never been on this kind of mission trip. And she looked at me and she said, honey, I want to tell you something. Our life is about to change. And I said, in great wisdom and faith, my life's not about to change. She said, no, our life is about to change. While I was there, I just sensed the pull and the call of God. So, consequently, from that one little trip, there was one little girl growing up in Huntsville, Alabama, that felt called to be a missionary in Africa. There was one little girl growing up in Pearl, Mississippi, who felt called to Africa. And there was a rocket scientist who was in Huntsville, Alabama, who felt called to change the world. And since that time, I want you to just think for 1 second what's happened. That church in Huntsville, Alabama was mobilized in a way that has never been mobilized before in history. And they began to take the gospel across the world. And guess who led them? Jim Atherton. And then that ignited something inside of Cindy and connected to her childhood and to our ministry. And it ignited something within us. And the next thing you know, we started going and taking the gospel to West Africa. And then the Lord called us to Arlington. And we came to Arlington. We told you that if you get us, you get Africa. And so we showed up here and we began the ministries to take the gospel originally to West Africa. And it now has spread all over the world. Hundreds of churches have now been influenced, mentored, blessed, challenged. Our church has sent 43 people to the field because of that engagement that Cindy had years ago in Africa, and it connected to her calling as a little girl because she connected to the calling that another little girl had. And now thousands of people have been impacted. Thousands of people have been led to Christ. Thousands of people have been mobilized, volunteers, people who've been sent full-time to live across the world. We have people right now living across the world. We're connected to churches that all emerged out of that moment when these visions and dreams came together and God spoke it all into the lives of little girls. So yesterday, I was standing at this funeral, and the funeral was packed with rocket scientists. Some of the people that put us on the moon. In fact, you had men in that room who brought Apollo 13 back safely. Jim's colleagues, his mentors, people that literally have changed the world. And here's what I said to that congregation. I said, you know, Jim Atherton, he was a part of a lot of launches in his life. And he was a part of a lot of missions. If I can say it respectfully, though, none of them as important as his mission launch. It's changed the world. So we came here, we began our work here, and some of you were here in those days, and it was a little challenging because our church was so invested locally. And so I shared with this mission committee that I wanted us to take the gospel to Africa. I wanted us to take the gospel to the world. And you know, we had people in those days, some who were looking at it thinking, I don't think we can do that, Pastor. I'm not really sure. And so one of them came to see me one day from our church on our mission committee. And he had a pie chart. And that pie chart was all of our mission giving at First Baptist Arlington. And he said, Pastor, let me show you something. Here's this piece, here's this piece, here's this piece, here's this piece. And now you want Africa. He said, so if I put Africa in here, everybody's piece just got smaller. Are y'all with me? Here's what I said. I don't want your pie. I'm going to give you a new pie, and guess what? Your piece just got bigger. And guess what, y'all? That's exactly what's happened. And so guess what we did? I was in a meeting with our missions committee, and guess who I brought in to talk to them? Jim Atherton. Jim and Patty came to visit us here in Arlington, and I asked Jim to come to one of those meetings. And Jim stood there and sat with our lay leaders and talked about how that had changed his life and how being a part of mission had given him so much meaning. And he talked about how he loved his job at NASA, and he had helped launch rockets to the moon and all these rockets into outer space. But he said to those people, nothing I've ever done in my life is as important as this right here. And it had an impact on some of our leaders in those days. And we launched an incredible worldwide ministry that now takes the gospel all over the world. And guess who we're teaching about it every week? Our children at First Baptist Arlington. Because we wanted to ignite something inside of them. We want them to have their hearts and minds alive with that flame of the gospel. Because God can use little children because the flame of the future is already in their minds and their hearts. So how important do you think this building is to me? Come on now.